This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Xi Jinping's diplomacy tour is the latest example of China playing the role of power broker, and the country's rise on the global stage has everything to do with its economy. As our own market sagged under the weight of the pandemic, China's soared. Since then, China's been building at a speed and scale America couldn't imagine, and that ambition to grow is now extending across the Pacific Ocean. If your news smorgasbord picks up tidbits from enough different places, you'll notice ripples. You'll see an item, a rush of speculation or panic move through the information system. And so it was recently with American farmland. And suddenly there were stout, insistent, flag-draped declarations from elected officials that China was not going to take over the American farm. Legislatures in different states looking at bill proposals. Kari Lake, who is still insisting she was elected governor of Arizona in the last election, saying once she's in charge, Chinese citizens would not be buying American soil on her watch. The Texas legislature broadened out to make their proposed ban even cover private homes. One version of a bill suggesting anyone who is still a Chinese citizen, even a green card holder, a legal permanent resident of the U.S., would be barred from buying a home in Texas. Nancy Qian joins me now, a professor of economics at Northwestern University, founding director of the China Econ Lab there, Chinese-born, and luckily for the purpose of this conversation, Texas-raised. Professor, what's going on with this China-rooted land panic?
Thanks for asking. I think this is a good example of a policy that has very good aims, but for which the methods that are being proposed are misguided and ineffective. There's this fear that the Chinese are owning too much land, that they're buying up all the farmland in the U.S., and there's this fear that this is going to undermine food security for the United States and escalate prices so that they become unaffordable for American farmers. Both of these concerns, while they're valid concerns, are really inapplicable to the Chinese context, the Chinese land ownership context. And here's why. The bottom line is that the Chinese own very little land in the United States. So right now, only 3.1% of U.S. agricultural land is foreign-owned. And this number comes from an incredibly comprehensive report that the United States Department of Agriculture did in 2021. And here's the interesting thing. Out of this 3.1%, less than 30% is cropland. What that means is less than 1% of cropland is owned by foreign countries. And another interesting fact is, who is the biggest foreign owner? It's not China, it's Canada. So the Canadians, who we hardly think of a hostile foreign power, owns the vast majority of the foreign-owned land in the United States. So according to the USDA report, the Canadians own 4.3 million acres. The second largest owners are also not the Chinese, it's the Italians, owning about 1.7 million acres. So China, including companies, individuals, all Chinese entities put together own less than 0.08% of U.S. cropland, 34,000 acres. So China is just not a big player in this. And, the USDA went further and did an analysis. They said, does Chinese ownership affect real estate prices? And they just find no effect. And this is hardly surprising when they own so little of the farmland.
When I first started to see this story and aspects of this story popping up in all these different places, I'm always looking for patterns. But I thought to myself, well, how much farmland is there anyway? And I rooted around in the U.S. Department of Agriculture website until I found the stat. There's something close to 1.1 billion acres of farmland in the United States, and China owns under 35,000 acres, which I think is like 1/26th of 1%. So how do you explain the politics? Obviously, there's someone who has an interest when they put on Twitter something with American flags and say, we should stop China from buying farmland. They own 34,000 acres, but they don't tell you out of 1.1 billion, there's political purpose behind that too. Is this a new yellow peril for the 21st century?
Oh gosh, I hope not. The last yellow peril was very unpleasant for Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. So let's hope that this is not the beginning of another one. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Behind all of this is a lot of politics. And there's two things going on in the American political economy now. One is that we have a lot of elections coming up. These are close elections. And one of the biggest topics in these elections are economic issues. How can we make middle America, how can we get them to do better? How can we improve the economic well-being for American workers, American farmers? And this is a really difficult problem to resolve and tackle. Policymakers, economists work on this nonstop, and there's really no easy fix. The second thing that's happening in the United States right now is a rising fear of a political competition with China. And that's well-founded in some sense. Recently, a lot of fears were heightened when a Chinese spy balloon was downed over the US. And also the political rhetoric from both countries, China as well as the US, has just really been increasing in tension. And so this makes people really concerned. And what's going on now is what you see is a confluence of these two forces. It's really attractive to voters to think that by shutting the Chinese out, that we Americans can do much better. That's just a really attractive message to sell because you're combining these two ideas at the same time. Unfortunately, it's just not true and it's not going to work.
What is going on in Texas? It's not just farmland in Texas. They are circulating a bill in the Texas legislature that would even ban someone who would like to move from an apartment to their own family home, who's a legal permanent resident of the United States, from being able to legally purchase that home. Let's talk first about the politics and then about the economics.
Okay, so this is a hard topic for me. I have a great fondness for the state of Texas, the Lone Star State. But what's happening now is what I would just call lazy politics. Politicians are choosing an easy way to be popular. Like I said earlier, people are concerned about the rise of China. This is just in the news all across America. And there are a lot of farmers in Texas. So this idea, convincing Texans to say that, hey, if we don't allow the Chinese to own land, which is something we can do right away through the legislature, then all of you guys, all of us will be better off. That's just such an attractive message for the governors and the senators to be promoting right now.
But why? Texas is now home to very large immigrant communities, South Asian, East Asian, Latino, even growing numbers of West African immigrants are moving to Texas. Houston is now one of the most diverse places in America. It has an ugly echo of some of the only American restrictions that were limited to one national group. America has an unfortunate history with the Chinese Exclusion Act of singling out Chinese in legislation and making them unable to move, unable to work, unable to come. And here we are in 2023, and the legislature, in a nationalist move, is saying, no, Chinese, no houses for you.
That's another great question. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is infamous at this point, banned all immigrants from China, and it also banned the Chinese immigrants that were already in the U.S. from becoming U.S. citizens. So it really separated the Chinese immigrants from everyone else. And this was at a time when America had more immigrants from all over the world than any other time. We call it the age of great migration. So just like now, it was a time of increasing diversity. And you might think, oh, well, maybe certain political parties backed it while others didn't. That just wasn't the case. Like today, it had bipartisan backing. If you look at the votes for the support of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was both parties all states. It was incredibly popular. The Chinese Exclusion Act happened after the recession of the 1870s, when the US was going through some economic pains that were hard to resolve. So most historians and economic historians felt that what happened was that US policymakers came up with a quick political solution by blaming the whole thing on the Yellow Peril, on Chinese immigrants stealing American workers' jobs. And the idea was to convince the American people, if we just get rid of this group, everything is going to be great. So it was incredibly popular.
But here we are. I mean, I wonder about timing. You are a Chinese immigrant who grew up in America. When you move on the street, in your workplace, on the L in Chicago, you are obviously a person of Asian origin. With all that's been going on in the last couple of years, with the China virus, with assaults against Asian people, with legislatures actually debating whether to bar Chinese people from owning homes and owning land, does that concern you as an individual, but also as a person who keeps an eye on the economics and on the history of these kind of issues?
Thanks for asking that. This is obviously something that I've thought about both for professional and personal reasons a lot in the last few years. First of all, I have to say that I think I just got very lucky that my immediate community of academics at my university, my neighbors in Chicago, have not acted in a way that have made me feel like this would affect me on a day-to-day basis. That said, it has been concerning. I have talked to friends, colleagues, graduate students, around the US who are really scared. They're just really scared. During the coronavirus, a friend of mine called me crying because her best friend, a Chinese American man, the woman who called me was a Chinese American woman. Both of them are born and raised in the US and Wisconsin, I think. Her best friend was in New York and he was shot in the back of his head. I actually don't know if he survived that or not. And, there was just a lot of horror and terror. And I have a lot of colleagues in other universities where they were very stressed. This was during the Trump years, when other people, their colleagues, I think in a well-meaning way, would tell them, we're going to have to nuke China. And this was terrifying for them because they felt like they had to choose a side, that if they didn't support it, people would think of them as spies or traitors and that they should leave. And if they supported it emotionally, it was very stressful because they have family and friends in China. So hopefully it won't ever come to that. But I do think that the space around Asian Americans is closing a little bit in terms of how free and safe people feel.
The whole momentum of the last 4 decades in the American economy was to throw open the doors and say America is a place that buys and sells, and we will compete with products anywhere in the world. Our farmers will compete with farmers in other places. You lower your rules, and we'll lower our rules, and we'll see who wins. So let's take a look at that land panic. If you say, even if you try to take off the creepiness and don't make it specifically about Chinese buyers, if you say, we don't want foreigners buying our farmland anymore. Farmland's a finite good. If it's here in the United States, we want it producing food for international markets from American farmers. What's the economic impact? Does it do anything positive for either the American farmer or, in macro terms, for the American economy itself?
The answer, unfortunately, is no. So banning land ownership is just not going to do much for the American economy. And here I'm talking about just normal farmland, right? I'm not talking about land of strategic value to the American society or the military. For that, I think is pretty obvious. Every country wants to control the land that's strategically important. So what I'm talking about now is just farmland, which is actually what most of the bill being proposed is about. And there's 2 reasons why it won't be effective. The first is just that foreigners, other than the Canadians, just don't own that much land in America. So if you buy foreign ownership, it's just not going to have that much of a macro impact. But then you can say, well, maybe this is about problem prevention. Things can change in the future. And if we ban this now, then we won't have to face a later problem of foreign companies or foreign individuals owning our land. Okay, so let's think about that. Let's say that in the future, foreigners own a lot of land. So what's the problem with that? Well, if you're worried about food security, then what you're really saying is you're worried that they're not going to produce food that the American economy needs, or they're going to produce food and then send it somewhere else to another country and not let Americans have it. So these are valid concerns. But there are lots of ways of addressing this within the current US policy framework without introducing a ban, ways that are easier to implement and economically more beneficial for Americans. So for one thing is we can just regulate the distribution of food. So in the current bill, there's nothing about the distribution of food. We can just say that food produced in America, some percentage has to be sold to Americans. We have policies like this about a lot of things in the American economy already. Another thing we can say is agricultural land has to be used to produce agricultural food, that they have to produce a certain amount of food given the richness of the land. And this is also something that's pretty easy to implement because as we know from the USDA report, the government already keeps careful track of what's agricultural land. And we actually have pretty good data of their production capacity based on geography and natural conditions. So I think that takes care of the distribution issue. And none of that is being discussed, but maybe we should discuss that. So the second concern is, well, letting foreigners buy land is going to make it unaffordable for Americans to buy land. And that's a concern. So that sounds right when you first say it, but when you actually think about the economic process that takes place, it's much more complex and nuanced. Because let's start with step one. When a foreign company buys land, what happens and who gets paid? That transaction is a foreign entity buying land from an American owner, and that results in a big transfer of money from a foreign entity to an American. So that's step one. Now let's think of step two. They produce a lot of stuff, and they own all this land. What happens? Well, yes, they get to make a profit, but they also have to pay taxes. Depending on the state, the tax structure varies. But let's go to Texas, the Lone Star State. In Texas, there's actually no state income tax. The biggest share of tax revenues from the government comes from property tax. So property tax is actually pretty hard to evade. And so these foreign companies that are producing things and making money off of land in Texas have to give a big share of that back to Texas. If you want to help American farmers, what the Texan government can do is to make sure that everyone is paying their taxes and make sure that that tax revenue is spent for the benefit of the Texan people or the American people. And one other thing that one can do is one can discuss perhaps a higher tax rate for foreign owners than domestic owners. And this is also within the current framework in the sense that right now, depending on the state you're in, subsidies are given to different types of people for different types of land ownership, particularly in agriculture. So this is just a small addition to that current policy framework, right? To have a tax rate that's different for foreign owners and domestic owners. And this can obviously and directly increase the revenues to Americans. None of this involves a ban. It's easier to implement, and the economic benefits to Americans are more straightforward.
The interesting thing about China, and the thing that makes it different, is that when American politicians talk about the Chinese economy, Chinese interests, Chinese entities, they insist that there's almost no daylight between private companies and individuals and the Chinese government. They almost always use the term interchangeably, as if Xi Jinping's name is going to be on the deed. There is a sense that's different from Italy and Canada, where if a private company came and bought land, nobody would think Justin Trudeau has a master plan for controlling American farmland. But when you talk about China, individuals and companies are used almost interchangeably with just the big, broad term China. and Chinese, as if this is a monolithic economic entity that's trying to make moves on the United States. Does that make it harder to have a level-headed, unemotional conversation about whether these bans are a good idea?
I think it's always harder to have a level-headed conversation when we're talking about something that feels like the unknown. This is really just a matter of educating ourselves about how China works and understanding how China works a bit better. You know, in all countries and all economies, business have connections to the state. How close that connection is and how much penetration the state has in terms of controlling individual companies, that's going to vary across countries for sure. I mean, this is a legitimate question and a legitimate concern. And how much that varies is going to vary by sector. Like even within a country, like the Chinese government is going to have different degrees of control and interest for different sectors. So to me, this is really just a question of Americans learning more about how China works. And over time, the more we know, the more we learn, the clearer it is and the less of a black box it is. And hopefully, when we get to that point, we can have more level-headed conversations about it. And it'll be harder for self-serving politicians to manipulate fears and push through insensible policies.
If you look at land that grows corn or soybeans or rice across the great broad, fertile fields of America, one thing about land, it's impossible to move. It is where it is. Now, if we were talking about timberlands, for instance, there might be a concern about vast clear cutting, loading all those logs onto ships and taking them to East Asia. Okay, but farmland is farmland. It's an immovable asset. And if we were in any danger of starving in the United States, which, as far as I can see from walking through American cities, we're not, quite the opposite, that land could be commandeered, or the crops could be commandeered. Emergency powers could be invoked. If we were really worried about not having enough food down the road, the fact that an entity half a world away owns land in South Carolina or Texas would be almost immaterial. If we were going to war with China, what would China do? Demand the land be returned? Some of this, it feels like it's so emotional, it's so freighted with emotion that people aren't asking themselves kind of the next question. Okay, well, let's say a Chinese company owns some land in California. Can they take it to China? No. So it is, for an economist, this must be an interesting thought experiment at the same time, because land is a commodity that's different from other things, isn't it?
It's really interesting you say that. So when all these bills started to come out a few weeks ago, I actually had this exact conversation with a colleague of mine who actually does research on conflict. And we were thinking it through. We said, you know, a lot of this is obviously riding on the fear of political conflict between the US and China and the rise of China, and maybe that someday there will be a war. Obviously, we all hope it won't come to that and that things will improve and calm down. But let's go through this thought experiment and go to the worst case scenario where there's going to be conflict. In that case, what would be the best strategy for the Chinese to do? Well, it's really not to invest in any assets in the United States. That includes land. It also includes mines and timber, because ultimately the US government controls the land and it controls its ports. As long as the US government controls its ports, it can control where the coal goes, it can control where the timber goes. So these investments are actually really bad for the Chinese if they actually are thinking about conflict with the US. It goes against Chinese strategic interests. Because as you say, ultimately, the US government has 100% control over all of these commodities and land. So while there are issues between the US and China, and there are issues for the US economy in terms of how to improve the well-being of the middle class, what we're talking about here is really just, for the lack of a better word, Economically, this is really just unrelated. What's going on here is politics, and it's simplistic politics. It's politicians assuming that the American voter can't actually think things through. As you said, once we start to think it through, it's just obviously bad for the Chinese to buy American farmland and be very invested in American farmland and hard to move commodities if what they want is to get into a conflict with the United States.
Nancy Chen, it was great to have you. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manoukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Our associate producer is Sienna Barnes. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.